Hello, I'm Joel Zachry, Wilderness Wildlife Week, and let's talk about the truth about bears. I want to begin by a big thank you for those of you that support Wilderness Wildlife Week. This is the 30th year, and mine and Kathy, my wife's, 25th. We're always honored to be a part of this fantastic program. And also I want to give a big thank you to the Pigeon Forge special events staff that make this happen. They make us look good, and we do the easy part when we all stand before you and try to share our love of nature. And lastly, of course, thank you for spending your time with me. To give you a little idea of where I'm coming from, I just wanted to share a bit about my background. I grew up outside of the Smokies, but growing up on a small farm, never actually visited the Smokies that much. I spent my career in higher education as a biologist, explored the park since about 1975 when I did my first backpacking trip, actually in the winter. My wife Kathy and I have led trips to Alaska for more than 25 years, and so we've had a lot of experience with both black, brown bears, and of course the grizzlies. We completed the Appalachian Trail in 2005, and I say that because folks often ask us, traveling from Georgia to Maine, how many bears did we see? And Kathy's answer always is, we saw very few, but how many saw us? And lastly, we're authors of Bears We've Met, which is a book about our experiences and sharing the beauty of a lot of different areas that are dear to us, and that book is available on Amazon. Whether you're an enthusiast, an explorer, or a researcher, bears need all of us. And an enthusiast is a person I generally perceive as someone that cares about the animal, wants to see it 100 years from now, their grandchildren to see it. An explorer is someone that just gets out there and has the joy of finding a bear track, maybe seeing droppings, maybe finding a scratch mark on a tree, or actually seeing face to face, hopefully at a safe distance, a mother with her cubs. And of course we need researchers. Researchers gather data and help us to learn more and more about these animals and how to better coexist with them. I wanted to use a couple of quotes here to ask you, when you learn about bears, learn about anything in nature, and perhaps anything in your own life, to look at your sources carefully. There's a lot of information on the web that we go to, and a lot of that information is not necessarily accurate, as well as the media. And these two statements, having dealt with thousands of bear encounters, I have never experienced danger getting between a mother and her cubs. The most dangerous situation is to get between a mother and her cubs. These two statements appeared in the same piece of media by two different agency biologists. So they disagreed with each other, and I would challenge you to go to a number of different sites when you gather information about any topic and try to find the most reliable scientific information that's out there. Bears are wild animals, and we never want to forget that. No matter how seemingly approachable, friendly, tame, or unafraid they may appear, that wild element of their makeup never changes. It is always there. They are not domesticated in any sense of the word, like our animals that we have in our homes, livestock, cats and dogs. 50 yards distance between us and them in our national parks throughout the country. It's not a recommendation, it's not a suggestion, it's the law, and there are fines and penalties when people violate that. So what's important about that? That's 44 feet per second at a full charge, and a bear can initiate that very quickly. So what does that mean for you and I as the visitor, the backcountry explorer, the backpacker, the hiker, the tourist? That means that a bear at 50 yards initiating a full charge, when it's distressed, it's startled, it's taking care of its young, it's feeling threatened in its space, it's going to be in your face in 3 seconds. Do the math on that. You can't outmaneuver, you can't outrun, or outclimb a bear. I hear quite often people say, well, if I go downhill, bears have short legs and so they can't catch me. They don't maneuver as well downhill as they do uphill. Well, think about this. They live in the wild 24/7. So they're very quick animals. They're used to moving on uneven terrain, and they move at an incredible speed, and we're no competition for that. So we have to use good judgment. We have to be vigilant. We have to go in small groups, and we have to give them space and not crowd them in any sense of the word. One of my favorite Far Side cartoons that goes back a few years, you see the mother bear in the background, And no one ever saw the Anderson brothers again, tossing a cub as you see here. It's a good lesson not to be learned by us in reality. The Smokies as a national park, and throughout parts of Tennessee, more so than North Carolina, we have an elk population. Around the northeastern end of the Smokies, we have about 200 elk introduced back in the early 2000s, and that population has grown very successfully. So what does that mean for us? They are another big game animal. Bears are fast, elk are even faster. Those signs out in the Cataloochee Valley say 50 yards again to keep one's distance. Elk move at 45 miles an hour at a full charge. Bears are not exclusively carnivores, but opportunists. And most of us would associate the word carnivore meaning meat eater, and perhaps even think they're waiting on us as a food source, which we're really not. But they'll consume vegetation, fruits and nuts, they'll lick up ants and termites, and eat carrion, dead animals, roadkill if you will, and small animals. And it's all based on an opportunity that they seize when it's available. Late in the fall and into the winter, sometimes we'll continue to see mountain ash berries. These are bright red against the blue sky when no leaves are still on the trees, and often we can see these and other kinds of seeds in bear droppings to tell us a little bit about their diet and what they eat. Sometimes we'll see a mixture of hair as well, as if you look closely, and probably most viewers wouldn't want to, but these droppings also have hair in them as well as seeds. Bears will lick up ants, termites, look for salamanders, any kind of insects for food. And you may say, well, why would they do that? They're looking for any source of fat and protein or carbohydrate. So it's all about the hunt for different kinds of food sources. So bears will eat most anything, including each other. We learned a number of decades ago that relocating problem bears from one area, say a picnic area where they've invaded, or a campground where they've been destructive, is not particularly a good idea. And think of it this way: a bear is moved to another part of a national forest or national park. It's moved into another bear's habitat. And generally an old male bear will kill a young bear simply because it has taken its parking space, if you will. Comparatively, coyotes are much the same as opportunists. Coyote droppings, you find a number of those in the backcountry if you're vigilant and looking along the trail as you walk. We call it scat, of course. And interesting to me, over the many years that I've explored the Smokies particularly, and examined coyote droppings, which probably most visitors, tourists wouldn't do, but as a biologist I'm curious, I almost always find bear and wild hog hair in those droppings. So what does that say to us? That says coyotes are opportunists, and they're feeding on whatever animal they may find, as well as vegetation, different kinds of fruits and nuts when they're available. So you may say, well, how do I know whether it's bear or wild hog hair? We think of both being rather coarse and dark, although wild hogs will be anywhere from almost an ivory color to black and everything in between. And they're exotic animals in the park. They don't belong. And we've had an eradication program for years, and they'll probably still continue to be with us in some fashion. But the hair is dark and coarse, and the hair of wild hogs has split ends. And so it's a little bit more fibrous, and often you can tell the difference when you get it in good sunlight. Probably won't go about doing that, but it's just a piece of information, and I find a curious observation when I find coyote droppings that almost always, it may have a mixture of fruit and fibrous material, but it will almost always have bear and hog hair within it. So there are a lot of coyotes, there must be a lot of bears, there must be a lot of wild hogs, of course. Would a coyote take on an adult bear? Probably not, but perhaps it finds an old bear that's passed away, a young cub that it can overcome, or perhaps in the same way, a piglet rather than an adult wild hog. So they're going to seize an opportunity just like the bear is going to do. So here you see coyote droppings, little bone fragments in that with hair as well. It's probably a mixture of rodent hair, perhaps possum, skunk, raccoon even, because again, they're opportunists and they're going to feed on what's available. They're very good at this, and they're very good at managing their population and coexisting with us. They've moved in around us, and they've learned they can move into suburban areas and take dogs and cats off the front porch, if you will. If you look at this view, particularly of coyote droppings, you see a mixture of hair and vegetation to the left, but looking a little bit closer, that standout circle to the right is a cat flea collar. Need I say more? Bears hear about twice as well as we do, so their hearing is very acute, but they have excellent vision, and they see better at night. Most animals, if we want to see them, we go early in the morning and late in the evening for our observations. It's probably not a good idea to go alone about at night looking for a bear, but they do have excellent vision and very adaptly can get around us most of the time. So how does this take place? They have what's called a biologic reflector system called the reflective tapetum or tapetum lucidum. And what that means is in the back of their eye, as a makeup near the retina, they have an extra layer of cells through which light can pass, giving them more or less a second look at what's out there at night. A lot of animals have this. We do not as human beings. So they're very adept at seeing things at night, noticing movement, and that's one of the main ways that they survive and avoiding any threats that they perceive. We've all heard the term deer in the headlights. Deer have this ability also. You don't see it in this particular deer because it's a daytime shot, but perhaps most of us with an increasing deer population throughout the country have observed deer at night through the headlights, and we see a glow in their eyes. It's much like Betty Crocker, one of our former cats, and you see it here from the flash from a camera. Now sometimes we see a red eye in family photographs, holiday kinds of photographs that we take, birthdays and celebrations. And what we're actually seeing there is the blood makeup in the back of the eye rather than the reflective tapetum. Different layer of cells. But it's that nose that drives the bear's behavior. That nose is an incredibly sensitive device, far superior to ours and far superior to most other animals. When we look at the black bear in particular, because that's our focus with this presentation, we notice short rounded ears. Some folks would say dark beady eyes, and we notice a brown muzzle with a large nose piece, if you will. And so that's a mass of olfactory nerves that helps that bear to find its way around. I like to say that most of us during holidays, we would go to the family dining table or perhaps a restaurant with our eyes. Maybe a little bit, hopefully picking up on the scent of food that we enjoy, but that bear is going to go with its nose because that nose is far superior to the other senses that it has. So when you look at a bear from a distance, up close, quite often that nose perks up, those ears flare up a bit, and what it's wanting to do is know what's around and what the perceived threat is. Bears reign out there in the wilderness, but they avoid conflict, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Bears often hear then, see or smell us first. So back to the Appalachian Trail, how many did we see? We saw very few, but perhaps a lot saw us, heard us, or certainly smelled us even from a great distance. Many of us grew up with movies, magazine covers, and various stories about bears standing up on their hind feet, looking very threatening. This one not so much so because it has its back to us as the viewers. Its paws are not extended outward like we often see in stage productions. And I like to say that's probably the best, safest position an invader can be in. An interloper that comes into that bear space, when it sees a bear in that situation, that bear is standing at attention simply to find out what is out there. It's not an attack position, it's not really a threatening position yet. And so what we want to do when we encounter that bear standing like this is to wave our arms, talk to the animal softly, not particularly try to stare it down, certainly not make quick movements, but to back away slowly and give it space. When its behavior changes, the bear drops to the ground perhaps, they may clack their teeth, they may salivate, they may swat the ground, they may use what we call a bluff charge to get us out of their space by lunging at us, coming at us like a locomotive. We simply should always move back slowly and give them that space. Moving quickly initiates that predator-prey relationship, and we always lose that race. I like to say if we look at scientific data over the past 100 years, black bears, grizzlies, and the big browns of Alaska, the fishing bears, if you will, who feed seasonally on salmon, those individuals that back away slowly, give them space, rarely are severely mauled and certainly not killed. But otherwise, bolting away initiates that predator-prey relationship, and we lose that fight. Bears really want no part of us. They know that they reign out in the wilderness, like I mentioned earlier. We're not a food source, but if we're perceived as a threat, they will try to neutralize that threat. And they always do that, particularly with young cubs by their side, because they know they're vulnerable. And cub mortality is about 50%. And again, do the math. If 2 cubs are born every 2 to 3 years, then 1 is lost. And so still we have a number of bears because of these defense mechanisms provided by the mother. For them, every day is about gaining and conserving energy. We're not so much efficient in doing that. We gain energy, we're not so good at conserving energy. We'll drive great distances to pick up a pizza, not thinking about the cost of gas or the distance we've taken or the safety or lack of safety involved on the highway. Avoiding conflict and risk of injury is always important to animals. It takes energy to do combat, and the risk of energy can lead to infection and death. So when we think about bears and how they've evolved, we don't have grizzlies, as you see here from Alaska, east of the Mississippi River. We have only black bears, and our black bears are black. Out west, some of the bears can be a cinnamon phase color, and they appear to some people to be as grizzlies. And I always say every bear west of the Mississippi should be treated as if it were a grizzly. So what's the difference? A lot of folks say grizzlies are more aggressive, they're more this or that. If you again look at the data over the last 100 years, the human fatalities caused by grizzlies or black bears is about the same. So there are more of us in contact with black bears, certainly, such places as the National Park, our Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But think of it this way, black bears evolved in the forest, so it's much easier to retreat to trees, to send those cubs up a tree, to avoid an expenditure of energy and a risk of injury. Grizzlies, brown bears, evolved on the plains, the open tundra of Alaska, nowhere to retreat. So they're going to tend to stand their ground, and so walking up on a black bear with their cubs in the forest like we have in the southern Appalachians perhaps is not as threatening as to walk up on a grizzly in open country in Yellowstone National Park. So we should always be vigilant and always give these animals great distances and keep their respect of their space. Hibernation and torpor are 2 topics that I like to share a little bit about. And I like to say that hibernation is a near-death-like state experienced by the bat. The bat goes into caves, as we've all learned growing up, most often, or hollow trees or different places where it can find solitude during the wintertime and some degree of normal temperature. All of those body processes drop down very, very low, respiration, heart rate, and so forth. We're losing most of our bat population throughout the United States due to a fungus disease called white nose syndrome. And the reason it is so significant to bats is because it attaches to the face of bats and it disrupts their sleep pattern. And when it does this in the dead of winter, they have no food available to them, such as insects swirling about in the air, and they basically starve to death. So bats drop their respiratory rate, they drop their heart rate, and they lie motionless for months if they are not disturbed by a disease such as white nose syndrome. Oftentimes in books we'll see torpor is a form of hibernation. Some books will say hibernation is a form of torpor. But the way I like to think of hibernation, again, is a near-death-like state where all those body processes drop. Torpor as an easily aroused sleep. And the bear is a good example of an animal that enters torpor. So what does this mean? This means that in the fall, usually around the 1st of December, they begin to seek out shelter for the wintertime, usually from about December till early March, depending on the wintertime. But it's mainly driven by a lack of food. So late in the fall, acorns, red acorns, white oak acorns are usually the food source that begins to diminish, and there's not much left. And so this is the way nature sends animals into a safe haven, by going into torpor. If we look at a handful of acorns picked up on the ground, and I challenge you to do this next time you're out in the fall, pick up 10, and you'll see that about 8 out of 10 have small drill holes in them, like these in the picture. 3 out of 4 of these do. And they were just randomly picked up late in the winter. So what does that mean? That means that if you will, roundworms, maggots, have invaded the shell, moved into the meat portion of the nut, and consumed it. So there may be a lot of acorns on the ground during a good year, but there's not a lot of nutrition. So bears have to feed continuously to put on about a 4-inch fat layer before they go into torpor in the fall. So we call this a feeding frenzy, more appropriately hyperphagia. I like to equate this to what humans do at the holidays. This probably looks familiar to most of us, even though we probably should avoid many of these treats. We still like them. Bears are feeding in a constant frenzy. We say almost 23 out of 24 hours in the late fall to acquire a 4-inch fat layer. Nothing much left that's nutritious, and so it's a constant battle to find enough food to get through the winter's torpor period. Even though these body processes are reduced slightly, their body temperature drops only slightly, they don't urinate or defecate, their stomachs shrink, their cholesterol level is about 4 times that of ours. They suffer no cardiovascular disease as a result of that, but they still have to find the best safe haven from winter storms. So our bears like to hibernate? No, they like to go into torpor in hollow trees. And generally they'll find an area, and we like to say that if they can get their head in the opening, they can generally squeeze their body in. And there's a lot of truth to that. Many times they'll go in the top of a tree that's been hit with lightning and make their way down through a hollow space. Think about wood as a very good insulator. It's protection from the elements. Some folks might look at this view here and say, well, if that's open at the top, won't they get wet? Well, they would. It'd be a very small amount of moisture coming through the open, broken portion of a tree. But remember, they're out there 24/7, and they have a fur coat that's very resistant to weather damages. So, when you go out there in the wilderness, you go out there as a hiker, a backpacker, a tourist, or just someone that steps out of a car for a few minutes, you may not be quite as interested as I am to find bear droppings, but there's a lot of information there, and it will tell you what they've eaten if you have a curious mind. You'll be able to see sometimes vegetation fibers, fruits and nut seeds, and you'll also see various kinds of hair, oftentimes telling you they fed on roadkill and other dead animals. Look for those tracks. Tracks are hard to find. Animals walk very softly in the woods, and bears, even though walking through soft soil, in my experience, leave very few tracks. They walk much like we do. They walk flat-footed. They have 5 toes, and their tracks do not necessarily show those claws, but they're short and rounded and sharp, and they're not retractable. Look for those signposts. Oftentimes people say, I've been out all summer, all winter. I've never seen a bear, but you've looked right at those signposts. And almost every signpost has been scratched, clawed on by a bear. Why do they do that? We don't know. Curiosity perhaps, but it's always a good sign that a bear is in the area. And it's good to be able to see that without being a threat to the animal or feeling threatened to one's person when they're out there by themselves particularly. I never pass up a hollow log. I will say in all my years of exploration, I've never seen a set of eyes look back at me. I might jump back quite a distance if they were large or dark and beady, as we say that bear might be. But bears will seize opportunities like this on the ground, wherever they can provide shelter, maybe at night, maybe during the day to sleep it off, and certainly during torpor. I like to close with one of my favorite pictures. It's not the greatest of photography. It's a little bit grainy. It's taken about 100 yards with a zoom on a 35 millimeter camera, but it makes the point that I want to make, and that is that this animal is far enough away from those of us standing along the road in Cades Cove and our Smokies that we can enjoy the animal, we can see the features, we can take a picture or two. And while it's looking back at us, it's not a threat to us. We're abiding by the rules of the park, we're well within a 50-yard range, the animal is having a good day, and so are we. So go out there in search of these amazing animals, and I always say to go not in fear, but with respect for their space. Thank you for joining me today, and certainly for supporting Wilderness Wildlife Week.